Welcome to Epic Church History, January 31st, 2021. I realized, and I can't believe none of you told me that the last four videos I put the wrong year, 2020. So no, we are in 2021. I hope that didn't cause too much stress for any of you. But we are on part 5 of Rodney Stark's study that we are doing, The Rise in Christianity. And today, we are going to be talking about some sensitive things. There's some disturbing content. There's no graphic images, but we will be discussing abortion and infanticide a little bit. So viewers and listener discretion is advised. Now, last week we were talking about pagans and Christians and some of the contrasts in relation to the plagues. Today we want to talk about pagans and Christians and their contrast in how they related to women, the role of women in society, how they were treated, how they were viewed, what opportunities they had, and the implications that that had for society. One of the things that we have to look at when talking about that was the attitudes towards marriage in general. Now, pagan men, for a while, they really didn't appreciate marriage. They weren't really into it. But Christians, on the other hand, they encouraged it. They thought it was, for the most part, a good thing, the indications are. And this had some implications of its own on what the effect was in the Roman Empire, in growth, in family life, etc. Something you'll see here is that one significant difference between the pagans and Christians in family life is that the pagan women were getting married very young. You'll see here in this chart that the number of pagan girls that were getting married before the age of 13 was about 20% before they were 13, and by the age of 14, nearly 50% of the pagan girls were married. These were to older men. As you'll see, there weren't many women to go around, so they were getting married at a young age to older men they may or may not be interested in. Now, Christians, on the other hand, they enjoyed more choice. They didn't get married quite as young on average. 70% of the women were at least 15 before they got married. So there's a stark difference here between what was normal in pagan society and what was normal in Christian society as it relates to marriage and what age you got married. And it turned out that girls actually appreciated not having to get married before they were, 15. This was something that made Christianity more appealing to more women. Now, there were also differences in the expectations of faithfulness. So, with the pagans, not only did the pagan woman have little say in who she married and when, but she was expected to be a virgin until marriage, but the man, not so much. The women, they were expected to be faithful to their husbands, but the man, faithful to his wife, not so much. The woman could not divorce the man, but the man could divorce the woman. And as you can imagine, the list goes on in ways that the men had control over the women in the relationships in terms of property, in terms of money, and other things. And as you will see in a minute, in terms of even having children. Now, the Christians, on the other hand, are a different story. The Christian woman has more freedom in who and when she wants to marry. Abstinence outside of marriage was expected from both females and males. Divorce wasn't condoned in general, but both husband and wife were expected to be faithful to each other. And overall, the women enjoyed more equality in the Christian family life than the pagan family life, as you can see. They also saw their relationship as not just between themselves, but between them and God. And this is why even before marriage, they abstained from sexual activity. They were faithful to God, but they were also faithful to each other once they were in the covenant of marriage. Now, sanctity of life. What we mean here and what we're going to talk about here is some contrasts in abortion, infanticide, and there were even contrasts in birth control measures among the pagans and the Christians. The pagans saw children as being discardable before and after birth, at least within a short time after birth. Children were able to be discarded without consequence or without real consequence. At times there were laws that were written that tried to stop this, but they had little consequence or effect in practicality. There were rarely penalties that were given out for infanticide, is what it was. There are major sources, major voices in the ancient time among the Greeks and the Romans that advocate for abortion. They push for abortion and describe times when abortions should have been carried out. There was Seneca, there was Plato, there was Aristotle. They all thought abortions were a great idea. Hippocrates, even himself, he performed abortions. And there's some really grim archaeological evidence that they were commonplace, that infanticide was commonplace. What they have found in sewer systems, for example. Now, whether or not a baby would be kept, whether it would be aborted before being born, or whether they would be left to exposure or left on the streets or whatever by the parents, that was determined ultimately by the husband, if the husband was aware of it. The husband could decide for a number of reasons that he did not want the baby. There are a number of reasons. Now, reasons of infidelity, this would be a reason that a woman would have an abortion, for example. So if the husband's away, she hasn't been faithful, she wants to hide the fact that she got pregnant, she might have an abortion performed. But they might also do an abortion for economic reasons. Infanticide, the throwing the baby out after birth, that would happen more often because of birth defects or simply because of the baby being a female. You have letters that you can read in which the soldiers instruct their wives back home to discard a newborn baby if it is female, as if it were a completely logical, reasonable expectation. It was uncommon for a family to have more than one female child in the household. They've studied inscriptions at one archaeological dig site in Delphi, and they found that out of 600 families on record, only 6 out of those 600 families had raised more than one daughter. So that's only 1 in every 100 families raising more than one daughter in their household. Now, the Christians, along with the Jews, they considered that both abortion, infanticide, both were unacceptable for any reason, before or after birth. They understood it as murder, and those that practice such things would have to give account to God, would need to seek forgiveness and restoration. Now, the primary sources for the Christian views, other than what we read in Scripture, include the Didache, the writings of Justin Martyr, Athenagoras, Minucius Felix. One thing that we read here is we regard the very fetus in the womb as a created being, and therefore an object of God's care. So you see that quote there by Athenagoras. Several early Christian leaders also wrote against certain means of birth control that were popular in the time as well. Now, the results of these differences in the approach to women, in the approach to marriage, in the approach to the lives of little babies, we don't have all of the data that we could have, I guess. But what we do know is that there was a disproportionate male to female ratio in the Roman Empire. around 135 males to every 100 females. It might be a little higher or a little lower depending on the city that you're looking at. But what happened was that if you're discarding the female babies, then you are going to end up with less females in your population. If Now, the abortions that they practiced back then were very dangerous and often resulted in the death of the mother. So then you have less ladies around. You also have less fertile women. So what happened with that, so we have a high infant and mother mortality, but we also had an overall population decline. And because of this had economic issues, it created military issues. Emperors and rulers had to come up with ways to build their army. They even had to recruit army members from other lands. They would offer land to other people from neighboring countries, for example. They would incentivize procreation. They would even make laws mandating all women marry. They would mandate that they'd have so many kids. But very rarely did these mandates bear any fruit in reality, in practice. People ignored them. The consequences weren't strict enough. They weren't enforceable, for example. But on the Christian side, they had, of course, a significantly higher female to male ratio than in the general population. In fact, it was almost nearly equal in some indications that we can find. The reasons, clearly, because they weren't discarding the female babies. They weren't causing their mothers to go into dangerous situations. So there was a significantly lower infant and mother mortality rate among the Christian families. And what they saw was their population was increasing. They were giving birth to babies. They weren't practicing the same birth control measures. So what was happening was the Christian families were bigger than the pagan families. And so just aside from the growth from conversion that they were experiencing, just by raising Christian families, they were experiencing growth. Now, one thing that's important to note, too, is that the pagan women in society, they were not given the same kinds of influential positions. Now, it's true that in some of the religious like shrines and different locations, the women had opportunities of leading in certain practices and rituals. But in the major roles in society as a whole, they were not given influential positions. They did not have the same kind of respect. But the Christians, on the other hand, it's clear that the women did have influential positions. It's clear that they actually were teaching and evangelizing and perhaps preaching. There were deaconesses that are even mentioned in Paul's letters. And we could get into a whole discussion on what Paul has written about women in the church and how that can be understood and applied and contextualized and what was actually the scene. But what has become clear is that there were women in the church that had a lot of influential positions. Now, because they had increased positions and privileges, this would have been all the more reason that Christianity would have been appealing to the women. It appealed to women for a number of reasons. It appealed to them because of the improved family life, not having to get married so early, not having to go through, killing your children, things like that. But the equality of women, it's the same reason that a number of slaves might have found themselves drawn to Christianity, because in the eyes of God, there was no male or female. In the eyes of God and how he is valuing us, I should say, there's no male or female, there's no slave or free, there's no Jew or Gentile, right? That's in the Bible. So when they see this, it's appealing to them and they're drawn to it. And there's a Guten Tag Secord theory. That's the names of two social psychologists, Marcia Guten Tag and Paul Secord, or Secord. I think they were married to each other. But anyway, they had a theory that when you have a higher female to male ratio, where there are more females, and it's either closer to equal or there's even more females than males. As you see the female to male ratio increase, there's a correlation where their privilege and positions and influence in society increases as well. So as women take up more of the population, they actually experience greater privilege, greater opportunities in that population. And so this is what they were seeing come about in the pagan society and in the Christian society. There were less females for every male in the pagan society. The females had less rights, they had less privilege, they had less position, they had less influence. But in the Christian society, there were more women, they had more influence because of it, more privileges, and overall a better life. Now, what this resulted in, and Stark talks about a lot of other little details that are pretty interesting in this chapter. He also talks about secondary conversion and the fact that a lot of women who became Christian first led their husbands to Christ, and the men, their husbands, would become Christian because of the women converting and how that went down. But overall, all of these factors contributed to the general rise of Christianity as it started to take over the empire as the religion of the people. And because of the population that was increasing amongst the Christians, the population was decreasing among the pagans. And there's a lot of problems that come when you're not maintaining your population, when it's actually declining. There's a lot of practical problems that happen. But for the Christians, Christianity was on the rise, their families were growing, and their influence in the Roman Empire, as a result, was growing. Okay, that concludes our brief discussion on that chapter. But next time, it will probably be the week after next. I don't think we're uploading one next week. We're going to talk about the cities. What did Christianity and the growth of Christianity look like in the cities, and why were the cities an especially good place for Christianity to grow? It's something that happened. So let's look at it. All right. Thank you for joining us.